When I moved to England in the middle of 2016, Europe was reeling from the biggest migrant crisis since World War II. Headlines brought stories of war-torn families huddled in refugee camps after risking it all to cross the Mediterranean in an uncertain voyage. And there I was on a cushy British Airways flight, flying across the Mediterranean, off to start my new life in leafy West London. Moving across the world it's never easy, but because my wife is a British citizen, I knew the challenges that I faced were a joke compared to what these people were going through, so I knew better than to complain. Those were crazy times, even completely aside from the migrant crisis. I landed in London about a month and a half before the controversial Brexit vote, and I left my native United States in the middle of one of the most divisive presidential campaigns in recent memory. You may be relieved to hear that I didn't come here to talk about those controversial issues. I'm only raising them briefly to strike a contrast with something quite the opposite, something uncontroversial, something non-partisan, non-polarizing, non-divisive. I work for Open Rights Group, which is an organization that works to protect basic rights like the freedom to speech and the right to privacy online. These rights are so widely agreed upon, they're the very definition of uncontroversial. At Open Rights Group, specifically, we work to protect these rights in the digital realm, so we refer to them as digital rights. So for example, we work to protect freedom of speech online, or the right to digital privacy, and so on. And it's a fascinating time to be working on these digital rights because humanity's relationship with technology has really passed a tipping point. 15 years ago, not everybody had a social media profile. 15 years ago, not everybody had a cell phone or even a decent internet connection. And it's true, much of the world today, there remains sort of a digital divide of have and have-nots. But within developed countries, mainstream society has in many ways transitioned into a new era, technologically speaking. And the result is that what were once considered esoteric and abstract tech issues are now having a much more visible, everyday human impact. You can see it every day in the news. Words like trolling and encryption and hacking, they've become commonplace. Last year, when there was a global ransomware attack, the human effects within the United Kingdom were immediately apparent because it rocked the National Health Service, and people's medical appointments were canceled, even important operations were postponed. You can also see it in the entertainment that we consume. Part of the reason shows like Black Mirror are so entertaining and also terrifying is because the visions of technological dystopia that they show us are so disturbingly familiar. So that's part of the reason why it's so important to protect our digital rights today before those dystopic visions become our reality. So today I'm here to talk about a particular digital right known as net neutrality. And just like so many basic rights across the world, it's something that pretty much everybody agrees upon, yet for some reason, it's in jeopardy across the democratic world. So what is net neutrality? Net neutrality is really just the simple idea that all content and all data online should be treated the same in how it comes and goes from your device. Net neutrality secures the right to share and access information freely online. And whether net neutrality actually happens is completely up to the compliance of the companies that we pay to bring the internet to our phones and to our homes. Because these internet service providers, or ISPs, or mobile broadband providers, as we refer to them, are the ones who control how information moves. So to be clear, net neutrality isn't just about any and all information being freely available online. It doesn't mean that the plans for a nuclear bomb should be easy to find online. And it also doesn't mean that all content should simply be given away for free. So net neutrality is specifically about the fair treatment of all legal content. And really, this is a concept that's never been possible before the internet, because no other form of mass communication is capable of delivering this promise. It doesn't make sense to expect all newspapers to be delivered at the same speed, and it's not technologically feasible for all radio stations to broadcast at the same range. But the revolutionary capacity of the internet, which is a truly two-way form of communication capable of empowering everyone, means it can and it must be held to a higher standard. And net neutrality is in many ways the foundation of that standard. This new standard, when we do achieve it, is so profound because it enhances two very different forms of freedom. Freedom of speech, and then also, importantly, freedom of markets. For freedom of speech, net neutrality makes it so anything I say online or anything you say online is just as easily accessible as anything anyone else says, including politicians, including celebrities. It means my blog on a simple WordPress website can get to your phone just as easily as the New York Times. This is a simple change, but it's a revolutionary break from the past and a massive boost for the individual right to freedom of speech. Regarding freedom of markets, net neutrality secures the level playing field necessary for fair competition to generate the current era of innovation that we're experiencing. It's because of net neutrality that a small company with a great idea has a chance of competing against a massive conglomerate. It's also because of net neutrality that you hear stories about startups begun in people's basements that ended up changing the world. So because net neutrality secures these two very different types of freedom, one that's very business-minded and one that's very individual right-minded, it's always enjoyed broad support in public opinion and across the political spectrum. Whenever the concept of net neutrality is clearly and accurately explained to people, it's enjoyed overwhelming support from across the world. And yet, for some reason, it's in jeopardy. Well, unfortunately, internet service providers have strong incentives to violate net neutrality by blocking some websites and emphasizing other websites. And this can happen in a couple different ways. It's gone out of fashion to describe the internet as the information superhighway, but it's actually a useful analogy sometimes still. So imagine for a moment that the internet is a highway, and all data traffic is kept moving the same speed by net neutrality. Well, without it, internet service providers are capable of creating separate paid fast lanes through a process known as paid prioritization. And in those fast lanes, whatever companies can afford to have their content, their websites, their products delivered faster, leaving all their competitors in the slow lane. So just imagine what this would look like in practice. Imagine all the biggest tech giants currently already dominating the internet, like Facebook or Amazon. Imagine if they could dominate even further because their websites were loaded faster than everyone else, and everyone else was in the slow lane. And imagine how that would cripple innovation. Net neutrality prevents that. Another process known as zero rating happens when providers try to decide what you see and do online by enticing you with free access to certain websites and certain services, or blocking others. This often comes in the form of a mobile broadband plan, for example, that has a data cap, but they allow you unlimited usage if you go to certain websites or use certain apps that they choose. So if your phone company has a relationship with Instagram, for example, you can spend all day on there, but if you go to any competitors, then it costs you towards your data. And this is just another way of rigging the digital marketplace and destroying that level playing field that I mentioned before. And unfortunately, it's cropping up in some surprising places like the European Union, which is generally thought of to have stronger net neutrality protections. There's an even more extreme version of zero rating happening in the developing world. Facebook has a program called Free Basics, where it's able to beam free internet access into countries that either don't have the infrastructure for it or people can't afford it. And that sounds like a really great idea, but unfortunately, the people that use Free Basics, all they see are the websites that Facebook wants them to see, and they don't see the websites that Facebook doesn't want them to see. And so for the people that use this new program, they're getting a biased introduction to the internet, and this is happening in over 60 different countries. So all these threats to net neutrality, they're all made worse whenever there's a lack of competition amongst the service providers themselves. This is a particularly bad problem in the United States, in the broadband market. It wasn't always that way. In the past, customers used to have more choice. But just like the story of every other form of major communication in America, be it newspapers, radio stations, cable or broadcast television, take your pick, internet service providers, over time, began to merge and consolidate and get into larger and larger companies. And as they did so, their influence over American politicians and regulators began to grow. And over time, they phased out open access laws, and this resulted in fewer choices for consumers. This decrease in competition very predictably led to slower connection speeds and higher prices for consumers. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I had a choice of exactly 2 different internet service providers, one from the cable company, one from the phone company, and they were both pretty much the same. Neither one had great service, and they were definitely both overpriced. This wasn't in a cabin in the woods. This was about a mile from the White House. Today, 50% of Americans have a choice, I'll call it a choice, but it's not really a choice, of one internet service provider, which is actually a monopoly. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, broadband markets, they remain far more competitive. And while that doesn't guarantee net neutrality protections, it keeps companies on their toes, because if they get a reputation for blocking websites or favoring other websites amongst their customers, those customers can shop around. Indeed, that's the beauty of the free market. But in America, those markets have been systematically consolidated, and consumers there are literally left paying the price. America currently stands 115th place, approximately, in terms of internet affordability, which is not too impressive. There was a glimmer of hope back in 2015 when American regulators decided to start treating the internet as a public utility, just like water or electricity. And what this did, essentially, is it made it so net neutrality was the law of the land. Unfortunately, this milestone was very short-lived. Just last December, as you may have heard, Trump's newly formed FCC decided to repeal those rules. And the only protection they left intact said that if ISPs do decide to discriminate or block websites, all they have to do is tell their customers. But what good is that information to customers that have no alternatives? It's completely pointless. On the face of it, this repeal looks like just another polarizing partisan issue. After all, the commissioners who voted it down was 3 Republicans versus 2 Democrats. But if you look at the polls, it tells a very different story. In a recent survey, it found that 83% of Americans are currently in favor of reinstating those net neutrality rules. That same poll found that 75% of Republican voters were in favor of reinstating those rules that just got struck down. Another separate survey done by a conservative polling agency found that 88% of Trump voters, specifically, are in favor of net neutrality protections. So you see, there is no controversy amongst the American public, which is all that's supposed to matter within a democracy. And the truth is, it's pretty hard to find somebody who thinks that big companies should be in charge of what we see and do online. And that's really what net neutrality is actually about. So I'll say it again. Net neutrality is uncontroversial. And yet these rules have been struck down in America recently. What does this mean? When public consensus fails to translate into public policy, it can indicate corruption at some point within the machinery of democracy. In America, it's not too hard to find a disconnect between the people's will and the law. The regulatory body that struck down the rules is an unelected body appointed by the president. The current chairman of that body is a former executive of Verizon, which is one of the biggest ISPs in America. From time to time, that regulatory body takes public comment periods, but what the public says has absolutely no bearing on what they actually do. It's a completely empty ritual. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, it's usually the ISPs that are brushing aside the public's will by exploiting legal gray areas within existing net neutrality protections to create practices like zero rating, which undermine the spirit of the law. So make no mistake, when legal loopholes are exploited to undermine existing law, that is a betrayal of democracy. The good news is there are many signs for optimism. The practice of zero rating, although it's been accepted in some courts within Europe, is being hotly contested in many other courts in Europe. In India, regulators there struck down Facebook's Free Basics program on the grounds specifically that it violated net neutrality. And in doing so, they shielded a massive cross-section of humanity from a narrow-minded introduction to what should be the most liberating technology ever created. And in America, despite the recent repeal, the demise of net neutrality is far from certain. The ruling can be challenged in court, and Congress does have the power to overrule the FCC. Future presidents, too, if they choose, can choose new regulators that actually respect public opinion. The fight for net neutrality is all about unleashing the potential of the internet, but it's also a huge test for our democracy. Thank you very much.